welcome to Democratic TV. My name is Matt Shears. I serve as chair of the Knox County Democratic Party, and I will be your host this evening for DTV. DTV, of course, is TV for Democrats by Democrats and often about Democrats. This evening, I'm joined by two stellar Democrats and state representatives. First, State Representative Gloria Johnson of the 13th District, and then also State Representative Sam McKenzie of the 15th District. These are our two Democrats representing Knox County in the state legislature, and we are excited to have them here. They're going to fill us in on some of the information that we need to know about the legislative session that in the General Assembly that just ended. They'll be sharing what maybe good came out of the legislative session, what bad pieces of legislation came out of this session, and then also what were policy items or issues that were left on the table that weren't addressed that needed to be addressed. So we'll go ahead and get right into it, and we'll start with Representative Sam McKenzie, as he is the rookie legislator in his first term, but already doing lots of good stuff. So we'll start with you, Sam. If you want to give us a little bit of background generally, but then also are there any kind of good pieces of legislation or things that you're proud of that you worked on specifically that came out of this session?
Well, again, thank you for having me, and I just thank all the people out there listening to this show for just your interest in politics. It is important, and we had a really busy session this year. It was my first, so I don't have anything to compare it to. But when we were just supposedly organized, we ended up passing a couple of really quick but heavy-hitting pieces of legislation that probably sit on the bad side of things. And then we had a special session. I will say the good that came out of the special session was there are additional dollars being spent for education. So it's not a flat line. We ended up having a flat line once COVID kicked in and all of the raises and promises that were promised were mothballed. So the good that came out of that was that people got a little more money into their pocket. And then as a result of the additional COVID spending that came down from DC, teachers were able to get a bump, which is not onto their salary, but just kind of a bonus. So those are two good things that happened. In terms of my legislation, I was able to pass 3 bills, but a couple of important ones. The most important one I think that I was able to pass this year dealt with daycares. Daycares, what came into people's head, daycares are really essential things and essential operations. A lot of them are individually run operations. So what the piece of legislation that I carried and Jeff Yarborough in the Senate was able to consolidate a few things like cafeteria operations. If there are daycares maybe 4 miles away from each other, they can do the cooking in one cafeteria, share those costs, and serve their students there, as well as backroom accounting and payroll things. As well as if you're keeping kids on the weekend and nights, you should get paid at a different rate than if you keeping from 7 to 3:30. So they're going to start changing the methodology which daycares are refunded at. So that was one. And then the second piece, it kind of hits near and dear to me. Those folks that may know me, and I had brothers, formerly famous brothers that played over University of Tennessee, went on to play in the NFL, had a nephew to play over there. What we've done this year was enable those athletes to seek additional sponsorship individually. The University of Tennessee gets paid a lot of money for those having the 5th largest city in Tennessee on those Saturdays. So just to have those individuals, often which come from really poor areas, to be able to get some money to help them and their family out in terms of endorsements, individual endorsements. So those are couple of the good things of that. And I was a co-sponsor on that.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, it sounds like very good work. And like you mentioned too, that in regards to good legislation, maybe sometimes the good legislation comes from DC nowadays and then comes to Tennessee in regards to the what Democrats are doing on the federal level too. So
absolutely.
Well, we'll hand it over to you, Representative Johnson, in regards to, are there any things that you want to talk about or things that you think maybe are good that did come from the legislative process this time?
Well, again, I probably don't have as sunny as outlook of Sam as Sam does, because I really feel like some of the things that were good, like he said, there were some good things about some of the education, but we are still, our funding, that even with special session and session in the budget, our funding still does not change us from being 46 in the nation in funding for our schools. As a matter of fact, when this all shakes out, Mississippi gave a huge bump to their education funding and specifically to their teachers. So what might happen is Mississippi might end up putting us down to 47. And instead of chasing Alabama, we might be chasing Mississippi. So, even though there is an additional spending in education, it is not near what the state requires based on their own TASER study that says we are $1.7 billion behind in education funding. So our teachers did get a bump. We did get a little extra money, but some of that was really more for state pet projects than it was for our schools. Lucky for us, the federal government has really done some good work for our schools with money that goes directly to them. So that's going to be really beneficial. I think that, but the problem is that money's going to have to be spent in a certain amount of time, so you can't add positions. And what we've still got to do is we've got to add social workers, we've got to add school counselors, and we've got to shrink some of our classrooms when it comes to reading K through 2 students, so that they get those reading skills that they need, and our teachers are able to do that. And that was one of the bills that I was really passionate about, was my bill to add school counselors. It did not pass, but we're going to keep working with it, because one thing that everybody on the committee did acknowledge, that we do need more school counselors. They wanted mediocre and more half measures, not even half measures. And I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to go in steps to get to what the social work field says is needed, which is one social worker to every 250 children. That's where we need to be. And when you look at the fiscal note for that bill, it is not near what some of the things we're doing in tax breaks to FedEx and other things, So we're making baby steps, but sometimes it's one step forward and 2 steps back. With the TANF funds, we did start to get money out there. Problem being, where you sort of used a middleman, where it goes through a nonprofit to get to the family. And we know the best way to get those dollars to family is to send it to them directly with a card, however that happens. But getting that money to families directly is the best way to make sure we get the best use of those funds. So there were some little things in criminal justice. There were some little things done, but again, to me, that's one of the 1 step forward, 2 steps back, because we passed more legislation this year, adding on to sentencing, enhancing sentencing, enhancing time, and enhancing crimes. That I'm not sure was the best use of our time, and it certainly added on to the fiscal note. And so, that's not what criminal justice reform is. Criminal justice reform is about reducing the numbers in our prison and making sure that we're countering recidivism with programs and all of that. So I want to see more, but we do have, people are thinking about it. There's bipartisan support for some of those things, so it's good.
Well, and in that regard, you mentioned it, Representative Johnson, about we do live in a state that currently has a GOP supermajority, and in some ways that means that they can do what they want in regards to their policy initiatives and policy agenda. And so we'll turn it back over to you, Representative McKenzie. What do you think were some of the bad pieces of legislation that came out of this session over the past couple months?
People that know me, I'm generally not a negative person, but there was some really horrible pieces of legislation that came out of this General Assembly, this first session. Just unfortunate things that really doesn't affect people. Problems that did not exist. There, as Gloria, I don't know where it was penned from, but there was a slate of hate, just hateful things passed for no good reasons. And it's unfortunate. And as a freshman, one of the things I was able to do while I was on county commission, it's like, well, you may not pass my bills, but you're going to hear my side of the story. You're going to hear an opposing point of view. Unfortunately, with that supermajority, at a whim, they can cut off debate, and it wins every time. That, to me, was one of the most disappointing process things. If nothing else, hear us out. Hear the opposing side. Hear the minority opinion. A lot of anti-LGBT legislation that was passed that was unnecessary. We're going to start putting our students out of the classroom permanently. Now, I'm all for it for students having a bad day, a bad week, a bad month. I understand that, but to permanently put the student out of a classroom, I think is a stretch. Things of that nature. There's just a lot. There was a lot of things that we passed. And at the end of the day, we'll jump on that. The whole critical race theory comes out of a point of view that you heard Representative Lafferty get wrong, just flat wrong. But the problem is most of the people, the emails that we got and the people that were supporting this ban don't understand what it means. It's just saying history is just that. Let's tell the fullness of history. These are things that we really can't deny. Like, once it came back from the Joint Committee, they talked about, these truths being self-evident, that all men are created equal. And I wanted to offer a friendly amendment that says, hey, at the time of its writing, that was not the case. A large part of our, so things like that, they just don't want to hear. And so it was so much. It was so much. And I'm still optimistic. We're positioned to do good things, but we need to have a balance. Right now, there's no real balance, and the dialogue gets weighted in one general direction.
Yeah, it seems like every couple of years there's some new boogeyman that conservatives come up with, and recently it's critical race theory. You say it, and it's like, ooh, critical race theory.
Yes, absolutely. It was a Common Core standards. Oh, that's a bad thing. There's not much difference between that and the state standards. But even now, when they say it, it's like a chill enters the room, like it's somehow a boogeyman. It was just a way of teaching that the SAT still complies with. So, it's things like that I think unfortunate because they get momentum, and it's hard to interject logic when someone's been convinced and been told that this is a horrible thing.
In regards to your perspective, Representative Johnson, what are some other pieces of bad legislation that you feel like came out of this session?
So for me, it seems like we're going backwards. It seems like there's an absence of leadership when it comes to moving forward. We passed the constitutional amendment about a right to work. And when you say right to work, it sounds kind of nice. But what that means is your right to be fired any day of the week with no due process and a right to work for nothing. And this is a state that wants you to work for nothing. As Sam said, not allowing teachers to teach systemic racism. And, that's really important because our laws set up that type of a system, and we need to address that. But we have a legislature that doesn't want us to even teach it. And there's never been a better example in the whole history of why we need to than a representative standing up and teaching something he thought was fact, which was an actual made up out of whole cloth. it's never been more important to teach about systemic racism and what it has, how it has affected this country and how it has affected people. The other one is the bill that we passed in the House, which was allowed immunity if you run over a protester. It made you a felon if you blocked traffic. Or there was a beautiful picture. Senator Harper, Thelma Harper, died recently, and there was a great picture of her from the 80s where she was on the commission in Nashville, and she was standing in front of a dump truck in the Bordeaux neighborhood where they were going to put a dump site, and the community was blocking that dump truck. That would have made Thelma Harper a felon. And it stalled. It went to the first calendar of next year. So, I've got a feeling it's possible that the Senate could pass it as well, and that's going to be incredibly damaging. And again, there's a huge fiscal note on that because it's going to cost. It makes people felons and jail times and big fines, all of that. Another thing that was really terrible was the permitless carry bill passed. You no longer have to prove that you know how to handle a weapon before you can have one and carry it openly or concealed in the community. The majority of Tennesseans did not want that bill to pass, and it passed. We had the fetal remains bill about forcing people to bury or the agency to bury this, but it was all based on lies. So many lies were told in committee and on the House floor about how these remains were taken care of. And they made all these lies up about these clinics, and the clinics contract with medical companies. And many of those medical companies do bury them. But they made up really heinous lies that sounded terrible on the floor, and they just believe that stuff. And we don't get called on enough to write those lies, and that gets to be the last word before there's a vote on the bill. It's really a mess. And for me, that huge jet fuel tax reduction for FedEx, when last year we gave the single biggest tax break for FedEx in our budget, which was we gave them a $21 million tax break. And that is after they got the federal tax break from the Trump administration. So since 2017, we have given FedEx a cut in their fuel tax 3 times. Since 2017, we have raised prices at the pumps, raised taxes at the pumps for hardworking Tennesseans. We have a legislature that is working for billionaires and special interests and not the regular folks at home. And everything that we pass virtually proves that. And then, of course, there was the remake of the courts. We have 2 Republican Supreme Court justices asking the governor to veto that bill because we don't need to remake our court system, especially in one evening. And I'm sure that Rep. McKenzie remembers this, where they found typos in the bill.
Right.
So haphazardly done. We had to stop and hang out for them to fix the typos in the legislation. That should be embarrassing. And then the other thing we did at the end, it was so terrible, was cut unemployment in half. Less than half, really. We cut the number from 26 weeks to 12 weeks, starting in 2023. People will only get 12 weeks of unemployment. And if you've ever been on unemployment, if you've ever been out of work, especially you have one of those jobs, I would imagine somebody like Sam, the type of job that he has is so specific, finding another one may not be that easy. I talk to professors all the time. Finding another professor position is not an easy task, and you may not be able to do it in those 12 weeks. But we are hurting Tennessee families by cutting that. And then, of course, yesterday, the governor did was just causing trauma to Tennessee families. He really is. by taking away that federal $300 on unemployment when it doesn't cost Tennessee a penny. This helps our families feed their kids. And he just took that away. And everyone, all the Republicans in the legislature, you saw them asking him to do that, asking to take that money away. And there's a fellow on Twitter right now, or a person, I don't know, male or female, that is putting out there every PPP federal loan that they don't have to pay back that legislators got. Most every one of those legislators that talked about taking away the $300 got a federal PPP loan that they don't have to pay back. They got their federal subsidy, but they won't let working Tennesseans get theirs. Sorry, that's a lot, but I have a lot of problems with that legislation.
Well, and you mentioned about how Governor Lee, we have federal dollars that have been allotted to Tennessee that are being sent here for unemployed folks to get $300 per week, and they're just saying, no, thank you. It's very similar to how Governor Lee and the Republicans have just said no, thank you to the federal dollars allotted to us for Medicaid as well.
Right. Right.
It seems like we have a pattern of just not accepting the money that we as federal taxpayers send to Washington to send back to Tennessee.
I shudder to think of the number and the thousands of Tennesseans who have died from lack of affordable care since we have refused to expand Medicaid. To me, it's criminal.
It is, and it's they're looking after special interests. What they want. They're saying, we want you to go back to work and make $8 an hour and figure out how you can pay your $700 a month rent and your $300 or $400 a month utility bill with the family and send your kids to daycare. We're putting our working people between a rock and a hard place. These people that have pushed our representatives and our governor to do this should be ashamed of themselves. And the representative, they're not representing their people. There are people in Farragut that are going to struggle with this, as Gloria said. There are people that have specialized jobs that they can't get by on what will be $325 a week to take care of their families for 12 weeks and then nothing. It's horrible. It's horrible. And another horrible thing that was said, and Gloria, I appreciate you touching on, was this, it's going to be delayed to January, but you can run over a protester. Even the dialogue, there's a mindset that protesting is now somehow, assembly is legal, but protesting is illegal. There's just pretzel logic in this. And they said, they said we should have had this bill when those people went out to the West Knoxville neighborhood that they thought was the DA's. So what they're saying, if you hear what they're saying, they're saying we should have had a law that we could have run over them people. Not that they were in any danger, but I wish this law was in place so I could have gone over there and done that. So it's inhumane to some of the things that some of the conversations that we've been having.
I remember I went over to talk to Sam and I was like, Sam, did I hear this right? Did they just say if you were late to get your groceries and they were blocking your driveway, you should be able to run over them? And he's like, yeah, that's what they said. And I'm just like, you're kidding me. It was unbelievable.
Well, and you two touched on a little bit in regards to Medicaid. Are there specific things that were not addressed this legislative session that you feel like should have been addressed? And we'll start with Representative Johnson first.
Absolutely. Medicaid expansion, of course, is a big one. And we talked about that a lot. We bring it up on the floor in discussion. I think this year Larry Miller ran the bill for it in committee. And of course, they tossed it out. And the thing that's so horrible about this year specifically is it's totally free. There's no little 5% or 6% on it. Totally free the next 2 years. Plus, they were giving us enough additional money that it would probably cover the next 10 years. So that was discouraging. Also, Sam was able to get something done on childcare, at least to help some of the daycares be able to do better. But Tennessee, much of Tennessee is a childcare desert. And we did nothing with the COVID monies or anything to help make sure that parents had childcare so that they could go back to work. So if you want somebody to go back to work for a low wage, but you're not going to make sure that they have access to childcare, and you're not going to get, they're not going to have access to health care through the jobs, the very least that we can do, if they're set on not raising the wage, which we must raise, is make sure that people have childcare and health care. It's just, it's ridiculous. And so not addressing that childcare and the healthcare, and not seriously addressing public education, not getting us from 46 up to maybe 36 in funding for public education. We had the surplus to do it, and they chose not to. And again, I judge a budget by, consider a budget a moral document. And this was an immoral budget, in my view.
Yes. Yeah, I'll piggyback on that, especially on the tail end, and just say what I like for us to do. We talk about, the chair of these committees talk about making our state great as far as education. We can't do that. You can build a great car. We can build a great vehicle. But until you put gas or electricity in that consistently and at the appropriate rate, you're not going anywhere. So at some point, we're going to have to open up the magic, complicated, convoluted BEP formula. And at the end of that, there needs to be more teachers that are covered under the BEP formula. There needs to be appropriate funding, both urban and rural and suburban, the appropriate levels of funding. It's difficult, but we have some really great minds in this great state of ours. It's time to do that. But at the end of the day, it's going to take more funding. And we bragged on the fact that we're coming out of a once a century pandemic with a $2 trillion surplus. I think was that the number, Gloria?
$2 billion.
$2 billion. I'm sorry, that's wrong. I added 3 zeros. $2 billion surplus when you count the general fund and the for TennCare, and we're adding to it. So these aren't one-time funds. We keep adding to it. So there's recurring dollars that are out there that should be put toward our education. So,
yeah. Well, thank you both to Representative Johnson and Representative McKenzie, and thank you all to our viewers for joining us tonight on DTV, and we hope to see you next week. Have a great week.